While I am changing Pinterest, I just want to thank you for coming. Thank you very much. It's a very beautiful day outside and you chose to be in the dark. And also thank you very much to Gallery Mitchell because, you know, I'm feeling really happy in this city. I think this city makes people happy. The light of the city, maybe. We're talking about light. The light is stunning when the sun is out. And very generous people. So thank you very much for inviting me. I was born in Argentina, which is, you know, the south, but it's not tropics, because we are the south of the tropic of Cancer. So even if my country is not in the tropic, we are in the global south. We are outside of what is considered the west. All these demarcations and cartographies are very complex. But I moved to London I moved first to Spain and then to London in the mid-90s to study. And when I was studying curating at the Royal College of Art, I came with this knowledge of Latin American art and culture and my own life experience into a world where many worlds live together. London is a place where people from many places, many cultures live together. And as I was studying and looking at the definitions of Western art and non-Western art, I started to get uncomfortable with these divisions and borders. What was defined as in the time of multiculturalism and globalization, which is when the art world was starting to be global, what was defined as eccentric was complex for me because, you know, it is a little bit of what you were defining when talking about photography. Who is looking and from which position and who is defining the other. As Edward Said said, you know, the author of Palestinian writer, author of Orientalism, he said, who has the right to narrate? So who is narrating when taking this picture? This is what Akinbode was trying to talk about. So looking at these definitions, you know, I was confronted with this idea that if you wanted to work with non-Western art, you needed to actually fulfill two categories, very broadly. One was you had to work with very exotic artists who would portray themselves as others, or you had to work with artists who would fall into the categories of Western art by imitating the artists of the center and therefore being accepted as such. So those two categories really disturbed me. I didn't want to work with within these parameters. I saw that both of them were problematic. So I tried to develop my own curatorial language and tried to examine, write and research ways of working, different ways of working. And of course I was in London, I was exposed to a lot of post-colonial theory, etc. So I was trying to basically, this is normal, let's do, sorry, this is terrible, we are terrible presenters.
No, it's accepted.
Are you trying to use a slideshow? No, it doesn't work. Trying to find definitions for things that were more in tune with our history, that were not narrated by the West, who we were in the global south. And that was reinforced by my contact with Africa. I started traveling to Africa about 10 years ago, and because I was interested in looking at parallelisms between the art scenes and our art scenes. You know, there is an art biennale in Senegal since the 80s. The Bamako Biennale of Photography exists since the 90s. This is a long time of cultural development that is not recognized as a history by the West because it's eccentric. So all these issues interest me a lot. And I started reading theories of decolonization, which were, for me, more relevant to define these tensions and controversies and complexities than post-colonialism as such, or definitions that were very British, because post-colonial theories are mainly British. So it was good to learn them and to be there. I live in Britain, so I recognize them as fundamental to their colonial history, but they had little to do with my colonial experience or the colonial experience of other parts of the world. Also because, as Mimi and I discussed many times, I am in the diaspora. I'm not in South America. I haven't been in more than half my life. And most of the people that I work with or I know have some kind of experience of displacement. So where does that locate you in terms of, are you in the north, are you in the south, are you half and half? That complexity also interests me a lot. So I wanted to look at the idea of what is tropicality. Tropics, as Bode defined them, as a geographical definition of an area around the equator between the tropics of Capricorn in the north and the Tropic of Cancer in the south. But then tropicality is defined by different sciences. So if you look at environmental Eurocentrism, the term tropicality is linked to the preconception of the tropics as wild zones of uncontrolled nature, and opposed to the temperate, developed or landscaped nature that we find in the West, so-called the West. This is a definition that encompasses centuries of determinism and influences the way we look at the tropics and we relate to it as an exotic torrid, you said? Place. And you can find it across many disciplines. It's in anthropology, it's in history, in botany, in medicine, there's tropical medicine, geography, you name it, it's everywhere. So I wanted to look at what anthropologists and writers were making of it, and in preparing this, I came across this authors, Daniel Clayton and Gavin Bout, who wrote about geography, tropicality, and post-colonialism in relation to the work of Pierre Gourou, who was a geographer from France. And I want to read a little bit of it because it was very interesting. He said, the concepts of Orientalism and tropicality operate as discourses of power by dramatizing the distance between us and them. And that is what we saw in the pictures that you showed at the beginning. Also the definitions of here and there. There is the other, the different. It is through this process of knowledgeable manipulation, Edward Said, the author of Orientalism, argued that partial and value-laden ideas and images of regions such as the Orient and the Tropics become taken for granted texts, create not only knowledge but also the very reality they appear to describe. And Western identity has been elaborated in opposition to foreign lands and peoples. Said said how Orientalism worked through an imaginative geography that rendered the Orient as an enclosed space and a stage affixed to Europe, an entity created and controlled by Western knowledge, including academic disciplines. And then Arnold, one of these geographers, similarly describes how during the early 19th century, the British affixed India to the tropics through the deployment of alien European categories of nature and landscape. So it's very interesting to see how these definitions that we consider so natural have been imposed on us by all this group of sciences that defined what the tropics are. So if tropicality refers to the geographic imagery that Westerners have of such area, and connects with Orientalism, Edward Said, by which the West subjugates the Orient while defining it as culturally backwards, how objective is our view of cultural production from these regions? The idea of tropicality gained renewed interest in modern geographical discourse when French geographer Pierre Gourou published Les Pays Tropicaux, the tropical world, in the late 1940s. This is the time, a little bit earlier, when these photos of the Nuba people were taken by Europeans. we have to look at photography also and think, Bode was much better than me and explain that because it's his specialism, but photography exists in Africa for a very long time, and it was probably discovered by local Africans in the coast areas, through the exchange with Europeans who were coming with cameras in the 19th century. So we are talking about 100 years of contact with photography. So photography as we know it of Africa is mainly through the eyes of Europeans, but your presentation did it also. I don't need to go back to that. I wanted to also mention for you this very, very relevant book called Crise de Tropics by anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who went in 1955 to Brazil to do anthropological research. Also, he was post-war, he had been self-exiled from Europe because he was Jewish, and he had a lot of problems in France at the time of the war. So he had started traveling intensely in South America, mainly Brazil, where he was interested in examining the lives of indigenous groups. So he traveled to very remote areas that had not been discovered before him in terms of anthropological research. He was a very odd anthropologist. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm not going to go into detail why he was controversial, but he was quite eccentric in the sense that when he starts writing his book on Crise de Tropics, the sad tropics on Brazil, he says, I hate traveling and explorers. The tone of the book is very ironic and it's very anti-Western in general. He spends a lot of time trashing Europeans in the book, which is quite interesting and significant because he was escaping Europe as an exile in a way. So, it makes sense at that time of his life that he was critical of Europe. But at least for me, he was capable of distancing himself from the European view of others. So that made him more sympathetic to the subjects that he was encountering. You have to think also that as anthropologists, he saw the tropics as areas of research where they were subjects, people, not just objects of study. He was the first humanist in anthropology. As a structuralist, he saw knowledge systems other than Europeans as valid as the Europeans. So that is important as a change in anthropology. He refers to the arrival of Europeans, that is Columbus, for instance, in the New World, in Americas, by quoting this. He's saying, when Columbus on his first journey stumbled on the Antilles, he thought that they might be Japan, but he preferred to think of them as the terrestrial paradise. This is another thing. The exotic, the tropics become this utopian place of desire, where, as you said, the primitives are seen as good, the noblemen, and the landscape is paradise. It's not threatening, but perfect. And he goes on quoting Columbus, who wrote, this is Columbus from 1490s. He said, the trees were so high that they seemed to touch the sky. And if I understood right, they never lose their leaves, for they were as fresh and as green in November as ours in the month of May. Some were even in flower and others were bearing fruit. And wherever I turned, the nightingales were singing, accompanied by thousands of other birds of one sort or another. So this is, end of quote, this is his kind of, view of the tropic as a perfect place. I'm going to jump ahead so I don't bother you, because I was going to talk about African photo, which you did very well. I don't need to go there. Latin American photography, more conceptual approaches to photography. So I chose two artists. One is Cal Guimarães from Brazil, who makes also films, not only is photographer, but he makes films that he has defined as kitchen cinema, because he works in a very kind of homemade way with a moving image. And he was born in 1965 in Belo Horizonte, in Minas Gerais, which was a state that was had a very difficult process of colonization because it had mines, gold mines. So first the Portuguese and then the British colonized this region and exploited the mines. I mean, they still do it. The British are still taking gold out of there. And as you can see in these images, this is his treatment of light in the tropics. It's very abstract. He also goes into a series that have to do with impromptu situations that he sees in everyday life that I find extremely poetic. These series are called gambiarras, and I explain the term in Portuguese. It's a very special term that has been used by many artists, in fact, and it's to do with the fact that you can make something out of nothing. So if you need to, you will understand very soon. If you need to mend something that's broken, you can use anything you find in your world. You don't need to replace it by something new, like this bra. You use a clip to keep it together. Or this, which is made with cardboard to stop the canopy from flying away. Or this, food stall where things are hung from bands, elastic bands and clips to hang clothes. So this is what gambiarra means. You made something out of nothing. His photographs are very poetic. He looks at landscape in a specific way. Light is very important to him. And these encounters of objects that seem to be very uncanny. I mean, discovering these footballs in a roof and making a beautiful statement out of this. I mean, there are other photographers in Latin America who've done that. Gabriele Orozco, you might know, and other photographers who focused on these details of everyday life that are discovered suddenly in the middle of, everyday activity. The other photographer that I want to talk about is Freddy Casco, who is an artist born in Asunción, Paraguay. Not the most iconic country in terms of making it to the global celebrity world, because Paraguay is a country that lived under very long dictatorship, nearly 30, 40 years of dictatorship. I don't remember exactly how many years, but they were very isolated because of that. At the time of this dictatorship, very right-wing, oppressive dictatorship, led by General Stroessner, as you can imagine, his past, German, probably Nazi. He's connected to the Nazis at the time of the war, when the Nazis are persecuted. He gives them refuge in Paraguay, and this is a very evocative picture for me, because this is Prince Philip, who is still alive and also still saying a lot of stupid things on the press. He is the husband of Queen Elizabeth, and he is here saying hello to the general. And in the background you can see a strange figure with a mask. That figure has been here. That figure has been pasted onto the image. These are images that Freddy found in a flea market. They're archival images that he bought in bulk from a stall, and he bastardized them by all these nonsense, bureaucratic and official galas all the time of dictatorship, where people were suffering enormously under the pressure of this repressive government, all these dinner parties. He manages to transgress these images by additioning very simple elements, like in this case a mask, or using the double. He's just duplicating this man who is, actually this was the most fierce dictator of my country, General Videla, who was the first, the head of the Junta Militar in 1976 when they took power for the first time, the last dictatorship. And he is signing a document, probably is the day of assumption of government or whatever, because he wasn't really passing power to democratic government, but he was signing a document, and he repeats the image of this man, turning the image into something really sinister. This is a body of work that Freddy Casco did in 2005 and 2006, and it's based on his recuperation of archival historical documents. So it's nothing to do with the tropics, but then he makes a series in 2007 and that he's still showing, that very interesting, called Ghost Chaco. Chaco is a region of Paraguay that it's also part of Argentina, is part of Chaco, because of course the borders, as in the case of Africa, were invented by colonizers, and then in the post-colonial time were kept to create nation states. But these borders are artificial. We were one people across this border between Paraguay and Argentina, and Chaco is an indigenous region where the Guarani and the Chirihuano live. And these people have a traditional ritual every year, I'm talking about the Chirihuano, the Chaco, called, which is like a Day Gungun in Nigeria. It's a masquerade where the dead come back to life, come back to visit the living, and are celebrated with dance, with chanting, with poems, with dialogues that are performed, as in the term performance wouldn't apply because this is our term, but they are performed by the living to welcome the dead. So he takes pictures of these people who are indigenous in his country, and in order to counterbalance the possibility of an ethnographic portrait of these people, he takes the pictures out of focus. So he blurs the images. Of course, they're wearing amazing, they're wearing normal clothes, but they're wearing, masks and headsets and very interesting collages of, contemporary clothes with traditional indigenous clothes, etc. But they are blurred, so you can't have an ethnographic look at them and make a precise commentary of these people as an anthropologist. When I was discussing with him his images, he said something very interesting. He said that he was inspired by Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. There is a sentence that Conrad is actually the only sentence that stopped me when I was reading this novel, where, Heart of Darkness is a travel that he describes in the Congo, whereby these Europeans go very, very much inside the Congolese jungle in search for someone, from a European, who has been stranded there for a number of years, and they need to retrieve him because he's doing crazy things. Apocalypse Now by Coppola was based on this book, Heart of Darkness. So there is a similarity in the plot, although the film is kind of aestheticized and narrated in a different context, which is, Vietnam War, etc. But the book actually is fabulous. But there is one sentence that really stopped me, and I thought, my God, this guy was a colonialist. But of course, he was writing in the 19th century. He was a man of his time. And the sentence is the one that Freddy Casco uses to display his works. And I will quote, he says, Conrad, "The earth seems unearthly. We are used to looking at it like a chained up monster, but then it was monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and men were, not human." And this is end of quote. When, he sees the other as not human, and the earth as a free monster, a monster that goes around uncontrolled. So this view that I was describing before of the savage and the landscape as uncontrolled. So Chaco Fantasma is a critique of ethnographic photography. By doing this blurring, he's actually telling us that, this is his strategy to refer to the impossibility of the Western gaze penetrating the other subjectivity accurately. So we cannot understand this. We should get rid of descriptions and try to be instead, I guess he's saying, poetic about it, which is something that you do as well. You don't describe in your photography, you don't describe anything ethnographic, local. You are poetic. You are using elements in photographs that have to do with something else that is not the obvious. So going back to a little bit to in time to the 60s in Brazil. Brazil was also under dictatorship in early 1960s. Brazil had the last socialist government before Lula, who took power before the government they have now, about 15 years ago. And this government was working on reforming the agrarian law and giving land to the landless and creating a lot of stir. And of course they were toppled and replaced by a dictatorship that lasted for 20 years. It was actually longer than ours, because it started in 64 and went on until 83. So in the mid 1960s, the coup was in 64. This group of artists started to develop a way of describing their culture that was very much about this complexity, this process of assimilation of many things. And that was the Tropicalia movement. This is a piece that was made by an artist who became a celebrity in the international world called Gabriele Salgado, who was alive at the time and he was very young at the time. And it was the first installation piece actually that was created with living plants and parrots. You see the parrots there? This is a recreation because it's constantly recreated for exhibition purposes, but the original one was made in an exhibition in São Paulo in 1967, and this is when singer Caetano Veloso, who you might know, and Gilberto Gil discovered this new visuality that had to do with incorporating elements of the tropical reality that they were living in within a museum that was essentially very westernized. A museum that was a white cube and it was trying to be as European as Europeans. So they were trying to pervert this idea of art as something purely inherited from Europe and make it more complex. And this is when they adopted, this is the first record that they, very hippie, very pop. They adopted a very, a patchwork of aesthetic statements from many things. You know, they were put on the same level, Jimi Hendrix and samba and bossa nova and rock and roll and Truffaut and French cinema and all these things together, and for them that was the nature of their identity. They were against essentialism, and they were against importing everything. Like saying, okay, we are a pop movement. They didn't want that, so they created this idea of being tropicalistas. Yeah, I was actually interested in what you said about similarities between places and art in the global south are not always conscious among us. And this is why I started my project, Transatlantic Connections. 5 years ago I started creating opportunities for artists from Africa and South America to go across, to do projects across. Because we are so colonized in our way of seeing who we are. This is why I showed you Tropicalistas, that we want to go always to Paris and London and New York, but we don't travel to Africa. And when I talk about Africa and South America, people say, why? So isn't it poor and terrible and difficult there? It's like, no, you know. So when I say these things that I said at the beginning, there is a Biennale of art since the 80s, and people like, they can't believe it, because it's the idea that we have of Africa, thanks to the media, what Achille Mbembe, the philosopher from Cameroon, names Afro-pessimism. This idea that everything in Africa is negative, yeah, that's been propagated by Western media, but also, you know, invested with a lot of economic and political interest. You want to perpetrate this idea, so you don't have the impression that countries have their own autonomy and that young people have technology the same as here and they communicate in the same way as here and they have the same aspirations. So all that is something that made me try to contribute something to this miscommunication. But we have a very similar position in relation to the the discourses of art and culture in the world, but we are not talking to each other, and that is something that interests me a lot. Just to mention briefly, the theories of decolonization that I was talking about before are theories that come from Latin America and are related to the theory of the liberation theology. You might know it. That was started by some priests within the Catholic Church that set to break away from the Vatican and create a movement that was quite politicized. It was the time of guerrilla warfare in South America, and they were trying to create a more direct link to real issues, poverty, housing, and trying to work in education and liberating people from oppression. They were incarcerated, they were exiled, they were killed. In the case of my country, these people who were practicing the theology of liberation. But this gave rise to new theories, and the new theories of decolonization that have been very much on the radar lately among curators and scholars that emerged from that origin. Especially Walter Mignolo, who is an Argentinian theorist operating from the United States, who talk about the need to de-link from the colonial matrix of power. And this is something that makes us be on the same terrain with Africa, and this is what I'm trying to explore with my work. Mignolo refers to he talks about geo-body politics. When talking about identity, it's interesting because there is something here that I'm going to read to you that is he's a semiotician. He talks about geo-body politics of sensing and knowing, which is foundational to the colonial thinking. In this epistemology, you are where you think. Thinking makes you, rather than the other way around. While in Cartesian epistemology, it is assumed that thinking is beyond the body and above geo-historical constraint. Indeed, this is the main principle of zero-point epistemology. He talks about thinking as and body politics, like you can't detach yourself from your existence in a certain place. So the tropics define who you are. This is a film that you can find. Basically, it wasn't a movement, it was a moment in history. It wasn't really, didn't last. It was on for 3 or 4 years. Caetano Veloso and Gil were exiled in London in '71 because they were in prison after this period, and they had to go away. So for a few years they lived in London, and that influenced their music very, very much as well. They were playing with Jimi Hendrix and people like that in London. So they were, absorbing a lot of the British culture. I mean, Caetano Veloso suffered a lot from London. I heard him say in a radio program once that London was a very racist place at the time. But Gilberto Gil adored it, so I don't know, depends on experience. But the last thing I want to say is that when Mignolo talks about, when he talks about time as well and knowledge systems, he says that the sense of time in Western knowledge is linear, past, present, future. But in other cultures, he says, such in Eastern religion, particularly Buddhism or other pre-colonial cultures, and spirituality, time is circular. And this is what I see in your work, somehow. You might be surprised, but I see that. Also, when you installed in Bamako your photographs in a kind of circular narrative, I was reminded of that. There is no beginning and end, and this idea of fluidity is there. So I really liked feeling that about the work. And you have a beautiful exhibition here, and I'm really happy to be here to see it.
Thank you, Gabriele.
I don't want to keep you longer. I mean, you should ask questions if you like. I don't want to talk more.